Pontius Pilate was appointed by the Emperor Tiberius in 26 AD as the prefect of Judea, the governor. And there's quite a bit of history surrounding Pilate that we know about, but the archaeologists have, for a long time there, were very suspicious. They said, yeah, you've got all this written stuff, but where's the archaeological evidence for Pilate? We haven't got any. And then in 1962, there was an inscription uncovered on a Herodian theatre that said Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, fitting together with all the rest of the history that we have about Pilate. So we know a bit about Pilate from history. We know he was a brutal man. We know that he was not a particularly good politician, as we'll see here. He can go one way or the other with his decisions. And in fact, he'd already had encounters with the Jews where he'd actually been outsmarted or outwitted or outbluffed. They'd made complaints to Rome before. On one occasion, Josephus, the Jewish historian, records how Pilate had threatened the Jews with bringing images of Caesar into Jerusalem, which of course was a blasphemy for the Jews. And Pilate said, if you don't go along with this, I'm going to have you executed. And the Jewish people called his bluff and laid down on the ground with their necks exposed and said, go ahead. We would rather die than be part of this idolatry. And of course, Pilate then got a bit worried, an unwarranted slaughter, get back to Rome and stuff, and he backed down. So they pushed him before, and he's either backed down or they made complaints to Rome. So it's not as simple and clear for Pilate to just, he's the governor, he's got the power, but at the same time, he's got to play this just right, or it could be trouble for him. Now, Pilate is a Roman. He's a pagan polytheist, meaning he believes in lots of gods. So if they're going to bring a charge that he's the Son of God, that doesn't mean anything to Pilate. That's no crime against Rome. There are lots of gods. But if they can bring a charge that says that Jesus is a king, that is, someone who could rival Caesar, then that's insurrection, that's treason. That means he would have something, or they would have something to bring a charge against him. And that's why Pilate asks Jesus the question, are you a king? And when Jesus responds in verse 34, we'll look at that, 18 verse 34, is that your own idea, Jesus asked, or did others talk to you about me? Now, Jesus is not being disrespectful here, as it were. It's imperative that Jesus clarifies with Pilate, what exactly do you mean by a king? Who's telling you this? What sort of king are you talking about? Because if Pilate only thinks in categories of the political king, the rival to Caesar, but of course we know Jesus is actually talking about a spiritual king beyond this world, in which case Pilate would find no charge against that, as he says himself, and there's no law of Rome being broken. So what we're really entering into this week, as we go through this text again, is to think of one man's conscience, Pontius Pilate, wrestling between hatred for the Jews, wanting to win, and yet his own conscience that says, this is actually an innocent man. Then he's got his self-interest, what's Rome going to think? And he's wrestling back and forth. And what we've really got here is a kind of a Shakespearean Macbeth kind of situation, where you've got a guy wrestling, there's an evil thoughts, and yet wrestling back, is this right? Back and forth. And that's what we're going to see with Pilate. We've got this wrestling between his own conscience of what's the right thing to do and his own self-interest. So let's read from chapter 18, verse 28. Then the Jews led Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor, that's Pilate. But by now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, the Jews did not enter the palace. They wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So they're not going to enter in case they become unclean, right? What we're going to see here is Pilate getting a lot of exercise today. He's going to be going in and out. It's like one of those revolving door scenes. You know, one of those little music box guys, they come out and they go back in. Well, Pilate's going to be doing that, in and out, because he's saying to himself, the Jewish people are not coming inside. Why? Well, Pilate's thinking to himself, it's because they're silly superstitions about their Passover. They don't want to be unclean. So I'm going to have to go out to them. And we're going to see this back and forth inside the palace. And no doubt he would have had his officials, every time he goes out to the Jewish leaders and comes back in, he'd have his officials and his clerks and his satraps all in tow, waiting on his beck and call, and he's wheeling in and out. But we're also going to see how his mind is going in and out, back and forth. Which way do I go here? This way or that way? The wrestling of his conscience. So he comes out of his revolving door from his palace. Verse 29. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" Because he's saying to himself, I know it's out of envy that they're doing this, from Matthew 27. I know they haven't got the right motives. And since when do these Jewish leaders care about protecting Rome or me from an insurrectionist? They couldn't care less. What's really going on here? Verse 30. If he were not a criminal, they replied, we would not have handed him over to you. Sounds more like guilty until proven innocent, thinks Pilate. Pilate said, take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. But we have no right to execute anyone, the Jews objected. No right to execute anyone, thinks Pilate. You're dead right about that. Don't you forget it. Only Rome is allowed to execute. The Jewish people are allowed to have their own laws, but they're not allowed to carry out capital punishment. Only Rome, only I can do it. And you're going to have to come up with something better than this if you want to find a reason to execute this guy. So Pilate wheels around again, back through the revolving door, and he's into the palace. And once again, he's got all the officials and the satraps behind him. Verse 33, Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus and asked him, are you the king of the Jews? And then in verse 36, Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jews, but now my kingdom is from another place. You are a king then, said Pilate. I've heard about this miracle working king from another world. Jesus answered, you are right in saying I am a king. In fact, for this reason I was born, and for this reason I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me. What if he really is a king of truth, Pilate's thinking. What if he really is this king of truth? What is truth? I'm not going to be manipulated by these Jewish leaders. I'm just going to tell them straight. He's back out through the revolving door again. He's going to, out of my way, you plebs. He wheels out. Once again, he goes out to them, and he's gone out, of course, echoing, what is truth? Well, they've been waiting for Jesus' answer. You notice that? Verse 38, what is truth? With that, he went out again to the Jews. He's not waiting. And said, I find no basis for a charge against him. I can declare him innocent right now. You can't do a thing about it. But I need to cover myself. If Caesar finds out, if I get in trouble, if they complain to Caesar, but I know how I can outsmart them. because it's their Passover time. Now they got this silly superstition in this Passover, and every Passover we have a custom where out of the goodness of my heart, I release one of their prisoners for them. And this is the time. This is my perfect opportunity. I can release to them, and it's a win-win situation. I can't lose, because if I release Jesus as a criminal, they get to say he's a criminal. They get what they want, and I get my conscience clear in releasing a man who's innocent. This can't lose. After all, it's not as though they would ever think of releasing someone like Barabbas, who's a real criminal, a murderer, an insurrectionist. Those zealots, those chief priests hate people like Barabbas just as much as I do. He's just as much a threat to their authority as he is to mine. In fact, zealots like Barabbas have even murdered their own chief priests. There's no way they would want to release Barabbas. So this can't lose. Verse 39. It is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the King of the Jews? They shouted back, no, not him. Give us Barabbas. That's not how it's supposed to work. I've got to get back inside my palace to figure this out. Back through the revolving door again with the officials, the satraps in tow. Inside, Pilate, sweating profusely because he's getting so much exercise, but also because of this conscience, this wrestling match. And his brain ticking over, and thinks to himself, I've got another idea. They can't make me execute him. They can't make me. But if I have him flogged, if I have him treated like a criminal, one who would be executed, how can they possibly knock that back? They've got to say, okay, he's been punished like a criminal. That's what I'll do. That's what I'll do. I'll get him flogged, and that way they'll back off, and I don't have to execute an innocent man. Call in the captain and get this guy flogged. The prisoner needs to be flogged. And that's going to solve everything, because when they see the flogging, this is a Roman flogging. This is not their Mickey Mouse Jewish flogging, 39 lashes and then it's done. No. The Roman flogging is one that goes on and on and on. In fact, a lot of the prisoners die before they even get executed with this flogging. You see, we have 3 levels of flogging. 3 levels, and the last level, the 3rd level that we give the criminals, especially those who are about to be crucified, is the baratio. You know what that means? It means the leather straps with these bits of bone and iron in the leather straps that rip the flesh and often kills the person who's being flogged. This will make them back off, and when they see what I've done to their king, chapter 19, verse 1, then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. And what a work of art it is too, to see my men, the soldiers, the trained professional Roman soldiers, correct procedure all the way. There they are, tying him up to the pillar, and then in unison, like a machine, one after the other. One, and then another soldier. So there's this continual lashing and lashing. It's like a work of art to see it. The soldiers at work. Wait till they see this great king of theirs humiliated. And my soldiers stripped his clothes off. Yes, there it is. And those leather whips. They can probably hear the screams outside the palace right now. This should let them know how we've really treated him as a criminal, and that should be the end of it. They could probably even hear the thud on his head as they struck him. The blood loss. And my men haven't finished with him yet. They're going to mock him. They're dressing him in a purple robe. That's purple, a sign of royalty. A mocking a king. And what's that they're doing with is that a date bush with those long? Yes, the long spikes, the 12-inch spikes. What are they doing? Twisting. They're twisting it into a crown of thorns, and they're sticking those 12-inch spikes into his head. Chapter 19, verse 2, the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck him in the face. Now look at their Jewish king. Now isn't that ironic? My men are mocking him, bowing down as this King of truth. What if he really was that King of truth? That means one day they really would be bowing down to him. What is truth? What is truth? I've got to go back out and show them what we've really done. What more proof will they need to know that we've treated him like a criminal, and that should be the end of it. 19 verse 4, once more Pilate came out back through the revolving door and said to the Jews, "Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, here's your king. Here is the man. Here is this pathetic mess. He's not a threat to you or to me or to anyone. Here is the man. I think you get the message that he's been well and truly dealt with. But chapter 19 verse 6, as soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify! Crucify!" But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." The Jews insisted, "We have a law, and according to that law, he must die, because he claimed to be the Son of God." He claimed to be what? Is he a son of the gods? Well, now Pilate is really afraid. Verse 8, when Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid. And he wheels back in again, "Out of my way, you satraps." And he went back inside the palace. "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it was not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jews kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." You're no friend of Caesar. I know what they're trying to get at. If you're in with Caesar, you're a friend of Caesar. That's how I got this job. I became governor of Judea because of my buddy Sejanus, who was a friend of Caesar. He was in with Caesar, and he managed to get me this job. The only trouble is, a few months ago, Sejanus kind of fell out a little with Caesar, and Caesar executed him. So my position is a little more precarious at the moment, and I just got to be careful because Tiberius is not the most stable Caesar of all. He could see it as treason if I am seen to be failing to eradicate a rival king. And that could mean my scalp. So back inside. Complete this somehow. Back out again, verse 13. When Pilate heard, he brought Jesus out, sat down on the judgment seat at the place known as the stone pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. So we've seen Pilate wrestling back and forth in his conscience. He knows Jesus is innocent. He wants to set him free. But at the same time, he's got this opposition. He's got to be concerned about his own neck. And after all this Macbeth-like anguish back and forth in his conscience, verse 16, finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. Pilate had the power. And we've just been looking at this wrestling back and forth. Which way? How do I get out of this? I've got to look after myself. I've got to look, all of that back. It could have gone either way, couldn't it? You know, Pilate could have just stood up a little bit more and it could have gone the other way. Pilate had the power, the final power to say yes or no. But then the Jewish leaders, they had the power. They had the power to threaten and push Pilate, to complain to Caesar about Pilate. So they've got the power. And ultimately, they've got the power because they get their way, don't they? So after all this back and forth, who's got the power? Who did have the power? Proverbs chapter 16, verse 9. In his heart, think of Pilate, in his heart, a man plans his course, but the Lord directs his steps. Yes, there was this, it was real what Pilate was going through. It's not just he's not some robot that God has just got. His wrestling was real, right? Those people who were yelling, crucify him, and pushing Pilate, their culpability is real. They will stand before the judgment seat, and their decisions, their power, will be judged. But look at this. From Acts chapter 4, verse 27, talking about this very event. Indeed, Herod and Pontius Pilate met together with the Gentiles and the people of Israel in this city to conspire against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed. They did what your power and will had decided should happen. Do you see this? There's something too big to get our heads around here. I've just said Pilate, his wrestlings in his conscience were real. The chief priests, they're yelling, crucify him. And all the people yelling, crucify him. Their decisions were real. People make real decisions. You make real decisions. But God is the one with the power who will bring about what his power and will have decided beforehand. Pilate, the power, chief priests, they think they've got the power. Those yelling, crucify him. But who really has the power? Think about this. Think about this. There's nothing even that goes on in a man's conscience, even in your thoughts, that isn't under the power of God to bring about his purpose and his will, either to judge you or to save you. You've got a Pilate maybe in your life right now. Or maybe you've had one in the past, a Pilate. Or maybe you'll have one in the future. Someone who has power to make decisions about your life, and you feel like even evil decisions, even wrong things. And what What can I do about it? I can't do anything. They've got the power. No, they don't. There is not one thing, not even the wrestlings of a man's conscience. Not even a man like Pilate who has the power to kill or to save. Nothing outside of the power. You've got pilots. You might have, you might be disturbed about decisions that are made at government level. People making evil decisions, plotting evil decisions, getting away with it. It looks like evil's winning. That's exactly what this text is all about. It looks like evil is winning. All that was happening was falling into the hands of the one who truly has the power. You have people in your life who make decisions over you. Maybe someone in authority over you, maybe someone like a boss or someone in a relationship with, or even a friend who's doing something wrong and betraying you or whatever it is, and they seem to have the power. And it looks like evil is winning. But there's only one true power that ultimately works His will and plan until His plan is fulfilled. Do you know, John's Gospel was written in the common Greek of the day, and it's a language that everyone to some degree would speak. It's most probably the language that Jesus would have been speaking to Pilate in. Because Pilate would not have spoken Aramaic, Jesus wouldn't have spoken Latin, that's what Pilate would have spoken, and they would have most likely been conversing in the Greek. Now in that language, there's a word for deliverer. Sometimes it's translated as hand over, or even betrayer. John's been using it through this gospel. He used it to describe Judas, who delivered, handed over, betrayed Jesus. And it's also used in we've already read in chapter 18 verse 30, the chief priests handed Jesus over, delivered Jesus to Pilate. Same word. Or in chapter 19 verse 16, where Pilate handed him over to be crucified. He delivered him to be crucified. See, we've got all these deliverers, but it's also the same word that's used at chapter 19 verse 30, where it says that Jesus delivered or handed over His Spirit. Even His last breath was under the power of Jesus Himself. He is the true deliverer. He even delivered His own Spirit into death. Even every breath, even every thought is a plan. And I say again, it's a plan that's either going to condemn you and judge you or save you. We've got all kinds of little gods who are making decisions over us. It looks like evil is winning when they make decisions, but it's always God's plan. And ultimately what we're seeing here in this story is the ultimate evil that's ever been portrayed in this world, perpetrated in this world, and that is the murder of the innocent Son of God, God Himself. There's no greater evil. And yet in and through that, it was all under the power of God to bring about the greatest good ever. So all the people there, all of the disciples of Jesus are saying that this is evil. God's losing. All the time He was winning. What was He winning to do? To save you. If in here, in that conscience wrestling back and forth, you would, even this day, repent and believe in Jesus. Turn from a life of walking your way and begin to walk God's way. But believing that Jesus has nailed your sin to the cross and entered you into a relationship so your sin is taken away. Even those thoughts that fail you in the future, even those of the past, are taken away through faith, living faith in Jesus, and believing that even when it looks like evil is winning, believing that the same Lord who has the power will work all things together for good for those who love God.